Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well. I'm going to. I can't even talk. I'm going to get Eric on the call here in 1 second, so we can talk about mobility. All right. So I just invited Eric to hop on the call. There he is. That was quick today.
Oh, I'm ready.
You're
Fired
you're
up.
you're waiting for that invite.
I was. Been waiting for that invite my whole life, Perry.
Oh,
Story of my life.
all right, guys. So we're gonna give it a minute or so, but today's talk is all about mobility, and we're gonna dig deep into the topic. It's something that has absolutely been a hot topic over the last, I would say 3 to 5 years, but even before that. But we'll give it a few more minutes, and then we'll sort of give you our advice and our experience on mobility training, when to use it, when to not use it, how to make better decisions, how to use a systematic approach to make sure that when you are giving your clients mobility drills, whether or not when you are giving them mobility drills, you want to make sure that you're giving them the right ones for the right reasons for the right areas, because just giving someone a handful of mobility drills is like giving someone a handful of types of medicine. You don't really know if you're actually going to get anything out of it, right? So, but anyway, um, yeah. So again, Eric and I have been talking, excuse me, about this idea of mobility training and it being a hot topic, and I think one of the reasons why mobility has been such a hot topic lately is because you get a bunch of these individuals out there that they spend a ton of time being mobility specialists, and there's nothing wrong with having that skill set, but it really starts with the initial evaluation and that musculoskeletal assessment or movement screen or whatever you do at the beginning, because if you just give someone a bunch of mobility drills or stretching drills or flexibility drills for the sake of it, you're missing the point, right? Because if you don't dig deeper and actually gather information prior to that, you're not going to be able to make the best decisions for your clients, and that's gonna hinder your outcomes. So, Eric, mobility training, where do you see the issues with it, the do's and don'ts? Let's hear it from your experience.
Well, it's a funny thing for me because, and I'm sure you've experienced some of the same things. You can go back, 20 plus years ago when I started out, nobody was really in our world, at least on the fitness side and performance side of things, were doing any type of assessments. They weren't really even thinking all that much about mobility. It was more, traditional strength and conditioning. And so I started doing that, and that ended up getting the label slapped on me that I was this, mobility specialist or flexibility guru, or, one NFL player had me saved as the foam rolly guy in his phone. So it's not that that was all I was doing. It's just that nobody else was doing it. And that's what kind of made people's, eyes open up a little bit to the importance of mobility as a foundation of things. When I say foundation, meaning that you don't get in your own way. And when we talk about mobility, that mobility is not your limiting factor. Now, how do we know if it's your limiting factor? Well, then you have to do some level of assessment, whether it's something as simple as a movement screen or something a little bit more detailed. Now, the problem with something more detailed is you can get down a rabbit hole. And the problem I've seen with some of the assessments, including my own, when I first started out, I did checks, internship. I did a whole bunch of different courses on learning different assessment techniques. And I'd be out there with my goniometer, and I had the tongs to look at your pelvic tilt and all the different stuff. And I would find out all cool information, but it would send me down some trails that I really need to go down, because it was really cool to know exactly how many degrees of glenohumeral internal rotation you had. But if you couldn't touch your toes, it didn't matter. Or I didn't really know enough to know why that was what it was, and if that was even good for you based on your environment. So I think the biggest thing that I've kind of evolved with mobility over the 20 plus years of doing this is figuring out, well, before we just go and start naming things as this is tight or this is weak, we have to start figuring out on a more global scale, how is this affecting your movement? And is this something that we even need to do something about? And so, I'm sure people will get and this is something we've even joked about, is how long would it take you right now to find a text on your phone that says, "Coach, my back hurts. Can you give me some stretches?"
Oh yeah, it's even worse. It's not even text. It's every time you meet someone and they find out that you're in the fitness industry. They're like, yeah, so I got this thing on my shoulder and it's when I do this, it clicks. Like, what should I do? And you're like, I don't know, man. Like, I have no idea. I just kind of politely, oh, you should probably get that checked out. But you're right. I mean, everybody wants an answer, and usually they're looking for a stretch, right? Because they think that if I just stretch more, things are going to improve. And if that was just the case, man, our freaking job would be so much easier, because if all we had to do is stretch to get people moving better, feeling better, performing at a higher level, man, our lives would be easier. But it doesn't work that way. And I think one of the reasons why everyone's looking for the stretch, if you look at the evaluation process, whether it's within the last few years or within the last 15 to 20 years, it's very mobility biased. If you think about all of those different types of evaluations, I mean, table tests, you can get someone on their back, you can do Faber, you can do internal, you can do external hip rotation, you can do Thomas tests, you can do modified Thomas tests. And all of those are mobility / flexibility biased. And that's cool. It gives us information, but oftentimes, if you don't know what to do with that information, it's the information is not even, it's a moot point. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why people are looking for a mobility solution, because they think, well, if something is tight, then I need to stretch it. But at the same time, what we really have to be asking is, well, why are you tight? Is there a reason? And then you have to dig a little bit deeper. And honestly, that's the art and science of being a really good coach and changing someone's movement, because maybe there's a reason why things are tight. Maybe some people have some genetic hypermobility and they have some areas in their body that are tighter, and that's for a reason. And that's really to hold them together. So mobility training is a tricky thing, but everyone seems to think it's the answer to all of our training problems, and it's just not.
Well, let's get back to the generic hypermobility in a minute, but the analogy that I like to use, and you'll appreciate this as a musician, is that it's like tuning a guitar, right? And they don't just tighten all the strings, they don't just loosen all the strings, they have to listen to each one and see what does it need. And so we have to look at that, and then the only difference where that analogy doesn't carry is that nothing happens in isolation. And as you said, there may be a reason that part is tight, and that's where we get into this mobility / stability, motor control argument, to say that for every part that's super loose somewhere, there's probably a part that's over tight someplace else, and vice versa. If there's a part that's tight, it's probably because there's something that's too loose someplace else. And so everything syncs up. And Coach Mike Boyle came up with this concept with Gray Cook of the joint by joint approach, and it's based on a concept of what's called regional interdependence, and that how we stack up, and that we have these series of joints that some are more mobile, like your shoulder joint has tons of freedom of movement, whereas your elbow really doesn't. It really should just extend and flex, hopefully. It doesn't really have a lot of play right to left or rotation. So because of that, we also had this overlapping stacking of what we tend to see when it goes wrong, right? And what do we see most people walk in with? We know that most people walk in with feet that are very weak and unstable, and they'll say they're flat-footed or they have pronation issues. And then you have ankles that are generally very stiff, and then you have knees that often lack stability, and you see knees that kind of cave in and crash together, and then you see hips that tend to be stiff, and then you see the lumbar area tends to be very unstable, and the T-spine and thorax tends to be very stiff. So you see this overlapping thing. And so if, let's say you come in and tell me you have tight hip flexors, and you do your Thomas test, and now we say, oh, well, that looks tight. And I go and stretch your hip flexors. That might have been the only thing holding you together, right? They might have been tight just to stabilize your trunk and your pelvis. And now you take that tone away. Now I've actually destabilized you. And at best case, we have what we call naive range of motion. It's range of motion you don't know what to do with. At worst case, now I destabilize you, let you out on the world, let you loose, and now you're a little more vulnerable than you were before you got on the table. And so I always tell everybody, look, I could put you on a treatment table and I could stretch you for half an hour, and you'd get up and feel like $1 million. You'll be stiff again, and just as stiff by the time you get home, because you don't know what to do that range of motion. And so for every inch of mobility we need to get, we also need to add an inch of control, or you're not going to keep it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing you talked about is kind of, when we use the word tone, we're talking about sort of the current state of the musculature that we're working with. And listen, man, the brain in the nervous system really is the master computer, right? It regulates everything. So there's a reason why certain areas are going to be tight and certain areas are going to be loose. It really has to do with, you know, your daily activities, how you treat your body, etc. But you can't outsmart your nervous system, right? You can't outsmart what your brain is going to do on a subconscious level. All we can do is we can gather as much information and then try to make slow, systematic changes, right? So, perfect example, with my own sort of training, my right ankle, I've blown out on several occasions, and probably a few months ago, I was working in the yard, I tripped and blew my ankle out again, and it was pretty bad. And the first thing that happened was what? My ankle got really, really stiff. Why? And it started to swell. Why? Because that's my brain saying, hey, listen, you've just injured this area and we're going to stabilize that area so you don't do any further harm, right? So there's a reason why, temporarily, of course, why there's stiffness there. But stiffness could just be a simple response to an acute piece of trauma or acute trauma, right? But the problem is that when you have this acute scenario where things stiffen up, the first thing we think of is we need to stretch it. But at the same time, remember what Eric said earlier, those hip flexors on that individual that's hypermobile is the only thing that's holding someone together. So in my case with my ankle, I needed to make sure that I slowly started to improve the mobility, but at the same time, I started to get more control and re-strengthen, because it's really this sort of ratchet system, right? If you gain a little bit of more mobility, then we need more control. We gain mobility, we need control. The problem is when we have these big gaps where we do all of this mobility work and we don't have the ability to control it, or maybe don't even know how to control it. And then next thing we know, we're running into issues.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So you mentioned stiffness and some of these words, and it may sound like semantics, but they're important. Because if you look at the difference between, okay, why would I feel the urge to stretch something, right? Well, one is if you put anything, you know, in its full length, right? You get any tissue at its extended length, it's going to feel like a stretch. It's going to feel tight. Now, that doesn't mean it needs that necessarily. And so I've had people where I had, you know, could almost put their elbows on the floor with their knees locked, and still they said, well, it feels tight. Well, yes, you have your tissues fully extended. That's your body's protective mechanism so you don't hurt yourself. We don't need to add more to that. But stiffness is not always necessarily a bad thing. You need certain level of stiffness. So, you know, especially like if you look in the ankle for speed development, Cal Dietz does a great series on talking about the importance of having stiffness in the foot and ankle when you're getting force production off the ground. Now, stiffness there is not the same as restricted range of motion and the lack of dorsiflexion. That's a lack of movement through a joint, the inability to not only set up in what they call an optimal instantaneous axis of rotation. You can get full range of motion at the axis of the joint. That's different than muscle stiffness, all right, which is different than muscle shortening. And they've done this it was originally Army research that did it, where they casted somebody in a bent arm position. What they found is that the tissue of the bicep would actually physically shorten. They would drop sarcomeres. So if we, you know, to make it really simple, and I always, when your name ends in a vowel and you're from New Jersey, if I couldn't talk with my hands, I'd be a mute. But if you can kind of see, to make real simple muscle physiology, kind of imagine from my knuckle to my knuckle and these overlapping bands, right? And those are, from that knuckle to that knuckle is what's called a sarcomere. And you have these overlapping proteins. When you contract, they shorten. When you stretch, they lengthen. This is what's called an optimal length tension relationship, meaning this is where I can produce and absorb the most force. I'm really weak here. I'm really weak here. So we don't really like being here or here, but there is a lot of value to getting stronger in either of these positions. So like I'm going to put up one of our posts about some end range stuff. And I know you do a lot with your fighters as well. For shoulders is really important for my throwers to get end range strength at both ends. So that's muscle shortening. Then you also have tightness that is more tricky in that it's more like neural tension as a protective mechanism, because they don't trust that you can go in that range of motion. So that's where, if you can take somebody, and the easy way to tease that out is, let's say you lay somebody on their back and you have to do like an active straight leg raise, and they only can get up, 30, 40 degrees. They can't get their leg up that high. But then you lay them on their back and you passively bring them up, and you can bring them all the way up to 90 degrees. That's not tightness. Or if you give them a little bit of a core stabilization, ask them to push down into your hands, where they create a little core stabilization, their leg goes right up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a control issue. That's not a mobility issue. And if you have somebody who lacks control, and you add more mobility to them, you probably made them worse. So there are some people, and you mentioned it before, circle back, Mike, to what that inherent hypermobility, like how do you discover that, and how do you address those type of individuals?
So when I'm designing a program, the first thing I do is take them through a movement screen, run them through an FMS, and then I do a bunch of breakouts. That's just something that I've always done, specifically because the majority of my clients are either professional athletes, fighters, or they are post-rehab people that are coming right out of physical therapy. So I need as much information as possible, because we need the right approach for that post-rehab client, but we need the right approach to have my professional athletes perform at an optimal level. But a lot of times what I'll do is, when I'm running through the FMS, I'm starting to see sort of patterns, not movement patterns, but within the FMS, we've got some mobility bias patterns and we've got stability bias patterns. And when I see someone that tends to present very, very mobile, within the FMS, it's the straight leg raise and the shoulder mobility. But if I get them on the table and internal, external looks good, Faber looks great, Thomas test, and I take them through all the table assessments and everything, like they clear mobility on everything, then I dig a little bit deeper. I actually take them through a Beighton, check the Beighton scale, and to see if we can actually conclude that they are indeed hypermobile. And if you're not using the Beighton scale, I highly recommend you add that into your repertoire. It's pretty simple, but what it does is it just gives you more information on how to make better decisions. But anyways, that's how I look into it. So if I see someone that is very mobile, but when we look at their overall sort of stability, rotary stability, trunk stability, and even glenohumeral stability, when we look at lower body and upper body motor control, it gives me more information on what they need. So at that point, I can start to make better decisions from a strength and conditioning standpoint, because I've worked with a couple female BJJ athletes that we do not do any mobility or flexibility work. Everything is positional, stability, and activation work, and they feel awesome. But what have they done? The same person like you were talking about, they can palm the floor. They don't need any more mobility, because they already have so much that they can't even control. Giving them more is just going to make the issue, it's going to make it harder for them to control things if you actually put them in a scenario where they can't even control what they currently have, and you're trying to give them more. It's just not going to go. And that goes into the whole idea of extremes and norms, right? And Eric, we talk about this in our course, and I'm going to have you take over in a second, but I'm understanding the difference between adaptations and extreme adaptations, or it could be genetics, versus sort of norms that we got from the PT world. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, and it just reminded me. So for the people that are trying to figure out what the Beighton scale is, it's a simple 9-point scale that you can look at, that looks at a tendency towards more joint laxity. And there's two things that kind of hold our joints together. There's the muscular tension, where you have muscles attached with tendons across, and then you have the ligaments and joint capsules that kind of hold our joints in place. And the difference is that the muscles have elastic tension, okay, whereas the ligaments and the joint capsules are more plastic in nature. And so the difference is, if you've ever taken a can out of a six-pack ring, which I don't know if you're familiar with doing that, Mike, at all, if ever taken a can out of a six-pack ring,
No.
it's someday. If you take it out, it never goes back in the same, because that plastic is now stretched and remolded. And same thing happens whenever there's trauma to a joint. And that's why when you see someone who has an ankle injury like you had, Mike, is that you're exponentially, every time you roll it, more likely to roll it again, because it keeps losing that integrity. So you need that much more muscular tension to hold that in place. So that's just a quick note. And so what I'm going to do is, I wrote an article on that, about the whole Beighton scale and how that relates to mobility. I'll post that up on our socials, later today. But the point you're bringing up is extremes and norms. And when we say, do you have enough range of motion? The first question is, for what? So, I'll talk about my world, and especially with a lot what we do with baseball. And then obviously there's a lot of carryover to what you do in MMA. But if we look at just rotation of the shoulder, right? And you could live a long, happy life with having 90 degrees of external rotation at the top end and about 40 degrees on the bottom end, and maybe even a little less. But if you're someone who's going to throw a ball, one is you need at least 135-degree arc for you to be able to do that. So from a performance standpoint, if you don't, you have a lot shorter range to create the force over. And two, you're going to start banging into the joints when you do try to put your arm in those positions, or you're going to make it up someplace else. Now, they've actually done research. Dr. Christopher Ahmad, who's the Yankees team doctor, is involved with a project that I'm doing. And he said, if you don't develop what they call layback, that's this, which I don't have a ton of, is if you don't develop that by the time you're through adolescence and you get into adulthood, you're probably not going to get it. So like my dream of being an MLB pitcher is probably gone.
Maybe.
Well, I top out at, I also top out at about 60 miles an hour too, so that doesn't help. So that's an example of, if you're looking for shoulder range of motion, when people say, well, if you look at like the FMS shoulder mobility test, and they say, well, that's not really good for pitchers, and say, yeah, you're right. It was never designed to be for pitchers, right? It's just looking to see, do you have baseline shoulder mobility for generic human fundamental movement? It's not looking specifically. Same thing if you look at the T-spine. Like if I do a seated rotation test with somebody and they get, 30, 40 degrees, and they'll say, oh, is that good? And I'll say, that's plenty of rotation to be an accountant. But if you're going to go out and swing a long metal shaft a couple hundred times this weekend, you better turn that thing a little bit better, or else it's going to find the next weakest link to find that range. And going back to that regional dependence, and where is it going to find it? It's going to probably beat up your shoulder and elbow and or your low back. And so we have to make sure that we get the right parts moving. And so that's where we have to look at the specifics of what are the activities and environments you need to go into. So like MMA, I would imagine, most people think, oh, I need to be tough, I need to do CrossFit, I need to beat you up. But MMA probably needs just as much, if not more, mobility than most sports, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, more specifically, when you look at jujitsu and joint locks and submissions, if you have really, really poor mobility in general, you're probably going to get tapped a little bit earlier. And let's talk a little bit more about that. So Eric was using the example of that layback position of a pitcher, right? So in the world of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there's the three main sort of upper extremity joint locks are an arm bar, which is you're basically trying to hyperextend the elbow. A lot of the times you can actually do some damage to the shoulder as well. And then there is an Americana, which is essentially you're trying to force someone into external rotation, right? Where you're really just trying to crank them back. And there's also a Kimura, which is the opposing thing, where you're trying to put them into internal rotation. So my point is with all of that, right? If you have really, really limited shoulder mobility and someone gets you into that position where maybe they're not ready to finish the submission, but they've got the positioning where they need to be. If you have very, very tight shoulders, you're probably going to tap a lot faster because you're hitting your end range. You're redlining faster than other people would because of your lack of mobility. So yes, there's a technical component and there's the intellectual component of grappling. But at the same time, from a physiological standpoint, if you are forced into a range of motion that you don't currently control or own, that's when things are going to start breaking. And that's when it comes to jiu-jitsu, that's really the point, right? But if you move really, really well, and you do get caught in that situation, I'm not saying you're not going to get subbed, but it's going to give you a little bit of time. It's going to give you a little bit of a buffer to try to find a way to get out of that. So it's super important, and specifically in the world of grappling and jiu-jitsu.
Now, the other thing that we get a lot of questions on when it comes to mobility is asymmetries, and right to left, and how much you should have right to left. And the one side of our world says, we're all asymmetrical. Don't worry about it. Life is asymmetrical. And the other side of our world is freaking out if there's a 2-degree difference from one ankle to the next. And The reality is that it's somewhere in the middle, and there needs to be a tipping point with everything. And that's how we find normative ranges of motion. That's how we find normative um, baselines, really, for any criteria. And so when it comes to asymmetries, usually most of it should fall within about that 10% mark is where most of the data shows us. So like NAPIC did research on hip extension and basically showed that if you had less than 10-degree difference from one side to the other, it doesn't really matter. It's when it got to that tipping point of 10% that it made a bigger difference. Now, for some people, if 10% was the number they landed on, that means some people maybe at 8% it made a difference, and some people it didn't make a difference till 12%. But that's kind of where we're looking, and within the testing, that's where even you're looking at your whatever you're using as your modality for testing has to be able to be sensitive enough to notice that significant of a difference. So asymmetry is important up to a point, but it has to kind of pass that threshold is something that we look for. And so I can tell you from personal experience that when you see asymmetry, especially at the ankle, and I don't know if you've experienced as well, and especially going through, what you said you went through with your right ankle, is that especially at the ankle, when I see significant asymmetries there, it usually leads to a bunch of stuff up the chain that nobody figures out is coming from their ankle. I can't tell you how many hamstring issues and low back issues that I've had, especially with skill athletes, a lot of skill NFL players who would have that. Because now if you imagine that when they're going to run and one ankle does this and the other one doesn't, they have to get that foot through somehow. And they're not going to trip over their own feet. They're too talented. They're too good at compensating. So how are they going to get that hip through? Well, they're going to hike the hip a little bit to get the ankle to come through. And you do that, at my speed, it's not going to make a difference because I don't move that fast. But if you do that with somebody who runs a 4.4, putting that much force through that, and you get that shearing at the pelvis, and you get that, now you're using one hip flexor a whole bunch more than the other. And now that starts to create some torsion in the pelvis. And now it takes the opposite hamstring and puts that at full length. And now you go to pull the ground underneath you really fast. And all of a sudden you tweak that hamstring. So there's a lot that goes into hamstring injuries. It's not the end all be all, but I've seen a lot of that in my years of where the ankle specifically, when they're not symmetrical, right? That becomes a big issue for everything else up the chain. And the problem is that guy goes in, gets his hamstring treated or his low back treated, and it feels better. And then as soon as they go out and run, it becomes an issue again.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really the difference between treating symptoms versus trying to find the origin of what the heck's going on. And I love the idea, the analogy that you, not even an analogy, the story that you used about, a lack of ankle mobility. And that really, as we sort of switch gears a little bit, we need to talk about compensation because, compensation is a dirty word in the world of strength and conditioning and even in physical therapy. And a lot of people think that compensation is bad. But here's the thing. Everybody's going to compensate a certain amount, but then we have to determine how much of that is going to be putting ourselves in a scenario that there's going to be a negative adaptation. And, we've all seen or heard stories about I had a right-sided injury and it changed the way that I moved. And then I had a left-sided injury. I mean, that happens all the time. And you gave a perfect example of that, but I've seen it so many times. I had a client of mine that he injured his Achilles pretty bad. And it was actually, he was actually sharpening his knife and it slipped out of his hand and it actually severed part of his Achilles. It was a crazy, right? And this guy did have a history of some low back stuff, but he'd been good for a while. He had that boot on for 2 days. His back was flared up to the point where he could barely move anymore. And he's like, he had to pick and choose. He goes, well, am I going to wear this boot or am I going to make it so my back feels a little bit better? And he actually had to go back to the doctor and say, hey, listen, I have this pre-existing issue. And the second I locked up my foot and ankle from moving, my back just got incredibly pissed off. So there's a scenario where the compensation got to a point where it started to become this sort of negative stressor or a negative adaptation. Because listen, adaptations will happen whether they're good or bad, right? They're going to happen depending on what you're asking of your body. But understanding how to manage those compensations, and like Eric said, that 10% rule is a really, really nice way to look at it. It could be 8%, it could be 12%, but compensations are going to happen. But the question is that how long is that compensation going to happen? And with those compensations, is it going to cause further issues? And I mean, we're getting in the weeds a little bit here, but it's important to really understand that everything affects everything. So it's not just an ankle issue. You know, it's not just a knee issue. It's not just a hip issue. I mean, you have to look through the entire chain. And that's why when it comes to looking at basic, even basic assessments versus really advanced assessments, you need to know what you're doing, because if you keep on stretching that thing that's tight, and it's tight for a reason, you could be actually creating more issues. And that's something that I think a lot of people do.
So we've been talking a lot about baseline. So the other end of it is this concept of enough, right? And that could really be any physical quality, like strength. There comes a point where you have enough strength where more strength is not going to get you closer to your goal and may actually be a detriment. So mobility, unfortunately, like everything else, people assume that the more the better, and that's not necessarily the case. And I've experienced this where I have people coming in and they'll say, and I'm sure you heard this before, is, oh, I heard yoga's good. I saw that so-and-so athlete does yoga, and it's tremendous. Look, it doesn't stick around for 5,000 years without being really, really impactful. And so a lot of the professional sports teams do have yoga instructors that that are tremendous assistant to the program and an adjunct to the program. We had a great one. A woman that worked with us when I was with Gwen Lawrence, who's with us, probably still with the Giants, and who was there when I was there. Now, here's the thing you need to understand, though, is that's an adjunct to everything else they're doing. It didn't mean they dropped all their other strength and conditioning and just did yoga. And you also have to understand that it's not going to have the same effect on every single person. So if I have that hypermobile individual who's a 9 on a Beighton scale, and who's super, who's 3s on their shoulder mobility and after straight leg raise and an FMS, and they are a 1 in their rotary stability, they're a 1 on their push-up, they fail all their motor control tests, that person's probably not a good candidate for yoga, okay? And even if they didn't have all those findings in their assessment, the thing you have to ask is this what they need to get to their goal? And so I had a woman who is a competitive athlete who came into me a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying, I want to get faster. I lost a lot of speed from when I was in college, and I want to gain that back. And then at the same time, she's telling me how she's doing yoga 4 or 5 times a week, and she wants to get more mobile. And I said, well, those two are somewhat against each other if you take them to the extremes. You can benefit from some yoga a couple times a week, but you also need to work on things that are going to develop the attribute of speed, because if not, here's what you need to understand. Do you know who the slowest person is in your town? It's your yoga instructor, right? They don't produce a lot of fast force because they don't have to. It's not part of the demands of what their art is. Now, that doesn't take away from the value of it. It just doesn't mean it applies to creating speed. And so I have to understand that mobility comes at the cost of something else sometimes. And so when do I have enough? If I don't have enough, yes, I can benefit from a lot of different things. But understand, when do I have at least the baseline for whatever my environment is going to be, and when do I have enough based on whether I'm just at a norm or an extreme. Then the other thing we haven't even talked about that most people look at for mobility is soft tissue quality. Right. And that's, there's shortening for all these different reasons we explained. There's also just, you have really crappy tissue quality. And I don't know if, Theragunning yourself 12 hours a day will necessarily fix that. Because if you keep having to roll the same spot on the foam roller for 6 months straight, the foam roller is probably not going to fix it. Right. So how do you start to differentiate for your athletes? Is this a tissue quality issue, or is this a true mobility issue?
Well, we'll answer that in sort of 2 different directions. My fighters all tend to move pretty well, but they're just usually very under recovered, and they don't take the time to do the soft tissue work and to take care of themselves. So I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of the time we're just trying to keep the wheels on the bus, right? Like it's a scenario where in their case, there's always something, right? They're coming in and something's a little tweaked and something's off. So, I would say for those, it's definitely more of a tissue quality, and it's simply because of the wear and tear that they put on their body. And the big thing that I try to instill in those guys is the importance of rest, getting a good night's sleep, and obviously hydration plays a huge role in how the body functions. But soft tissue work is super important and can be very, very impactful. But you have to know what you're doing, right? It's not just foam rolling the world and things are going to get better. And then you look at mobility, right? You look at when you do those assessments, then you start to see, well, if someone does have a significant deficit where you do need to improve a range of motion, that's when you can use whatever skill set that you have. It could be using a foam roller. It could be using like a Mobo unit. It could be using a lacrosse ball. And then what you're going to do is you're basically going to go through whatever modality you feel is going to be beneficial, and then test and retest and see if you've actually made a positive impact. So I think even the bigger question is lifestyle wise, like what are you doing to your body? Because I think a lot of people, I think one of the main reasons why they feel like crap and they move like crap is because they think training more is the answer, where if you're training a lot already, maybe just recovering more is exactly what you need. And that's gonna move things in the right direction.
Yeah, and having the balance to your point of inputs and outputs. And a lot of people are looking for, what can I do on the output side of what can I do to the tissue? And sometimes they don't realize what do you need to stop doing to it, right? And also understand that it's relative to the individual. We talk about this in the courses, like if you take someone who's sedentary, who sits at a desk all day, and you ask them just to sit on the floor, it's really, really uncomfortable. And Katie Bowman talks about this a lot, and talking about natural movement and just the impact of our cushiony footwear, our cushiony couches and chairs and beds and so forth, and how much that's made our tissue super sensitive to any level of pressure. And you take that individual and you give them, body tempering with a couple 100-pound, steel roller, it's going to really create more of a flare up than it is a healing situation. But then on the flip side, you take a 300-pound lineman and you give them that squishy, yellow tinted crushed foam roller that's been stuck in the corner of the clinic for the last 5 years, and you have them to foam roll their thigh. It's not making a dent. It's just not. And so from an impact perspective, from the soft tissue stuff, that has to be relative to the individual. It doesn't have to be, not everything has to be like Ralphing, where you're feeling tissue, getting pulled apart, and really good Ralphers actually have a way of managing that pain. Or you also look at it from the impact from just an overall time perspective. Like if you think that your 30 seconds on each side doing a half kneeling hip flexor stretch is going to undo 9 hours of sitting at your dining room table over a laptop, it's like emptying the ocean with a Dixie cup. Like it's relative to the inputs and outputs. And so sometimes the best mobility is just getting up and going for a walk a couple times as a break, and just to undo the habits that we get into. And so again, a lot of that comes back to not just habits, but like you alluded to, is the nervous system drives all of this, to the point where they actually will strap your arms to the table when you get anesthesia, because if you didn't and your arm falls off the table, you could dislocate your joint because there's none of that resting tension sitting in there. And so what's driving a lot of that tension is our nervous system, and how do we manipulate that? And there's a million different ways. And that's basically what we can wrap the whole thing up with, is that I can gain mobility in about 12 different ways right now. Now, the key is, can you now own that new range of motion so we don't have to keep doing that same thing over and over again? And the most successful modality is going to be the one that we can get it to stick. So for some people, that's FRC and doing cars and doing more active range of motion. For some people, it may be soft tissue work, or even maybe joint mobilization. For other people, it may be complete motor control, where maybe walking on a balance beam. So realize there is no one end all be all. And it's not static stretching is bad and dynamic stretching is good, or any of these things. Is that each person kind of needs a different thing, because you have to do the backtracking and say, well, how did we get here? How do we get here? And then how do we know we have at least the minimum? And how do we know we have enough?
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, I think it really comes down to your ability to run someone through an evaluation, because when you understand how to run all of those assessments, whether you're going super in depth or whether you're going, a little bit more sort of global movement patterns, understanding what to do with that information is probably the most important thing, because I've experienced scenarios where people have said, well, I did this assessment and this is what we found, but they don't know what to do with the information. So that's another key part of it, is you can tell someone all these things that are wrong, but do you actually have the skill set to make it right? So, I think the takeaways from here is again, like Eric said, the nervous system really governs all this stuff, right? It is really the sort of the main computer that dictates tone and tension, and also will allow you to respond to situations rather quickly, depending on what's going on from an environmental standpoint. But, understanding that is going to override things. And then also understanding how your clients respond, what their lifestyle looks like. I think there's so many factors into getting someone to move well, and just simply thinking that, hey, there's a stretch for that, is going to be the answer. Well, guess what? It's not gonna bode so well. So, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. You guys can send us some messages on our DMs here. But appreciate you guys tuning in. Eric, anything else you want to cover?
No, as far as mobility, we'll wrap it up. We have a couple more mobility posts. If you've been getting in tune with the stuff we've been doing different themes each week. This week was all about mobility. Next week, we're going to be talking about the costs of training. And there's multiple costs of training. And this is a conversation that has gotten to become a hot topic as of late because of a post that Coach Mike Boyle put out talking about he framed it as orthopedic costs, but it's something we actually call structural costs, and it's one of multiple costs that we talk about in our course. And I'm going to be breaking down all those different costs. And then I'm flying solo next week. Mike's taking a much needed break with the family, but he will be back in 2 weeks. So I'm going to hold down the fort next week. So it'll be on my Instagram. That's Eric DeGatti. So make sure you stay tuned for that. And we'll have different ones, as we go. We're going to have one on kettlebells. We're going to have one, I believe the week after the cost of training, we're doing one on training for fat loss and how we structure our programs, if that's one of our goals. So each week we have different topics, but as Mike said, please drop us a line. You can shoot us a message in our direct messages, or you can email us at principlesofprogramdesign@gmail. Give us any ideas that you have for topics or any questions you have. Also stay tuned, because we are going to be releasing our online course in March. We're also having our first live course in May. And if you also want to get a package of an email of all our posts for the week, if you don't happen to catch it when it comes up your stream, email us for that as well. We send out an email every Sunday morning that Mike's wife put together, a nice set of a summary of all the different posts we've been doing throughout the week, including a link to these lives. If you missed any of it, you can go back and watch it again.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Have a good weekend.
See you, buddy.